My father stopped answering my calls 3 months after he started dating a woman he'd met at a grief support group, and by the time I finally got him alone in a room without her, he'd already signed over power of attorney to someone our family had known for less than a year. This isn't a story about romance gone wrong. This is a story about how quickly a grieving, lonely person can be systematically separated from everyone who loves them, and how long it actually takes to undo that kind of damage once you finally see it clearly. My name is Chris, and my father's name is Walter. This is the story of the 11 months we almost lost him to a woman named Dawn, and the 2 years it took, afterward, to fully bring him back. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 34, after a 14-month illness that took nearly everything out of both my parents before it finally took her life. My father, Walter, was 68 at the time, and the two of them had been married for 41 years. I don't think I fully understood, until I watched him after her death, just how completely a marriage that long becomes the entire architecture of a person's daily life. Not just the big things, the anniversaries and holidays, but the small, structural things. Who made coffee in the morning? Who remembered which neighbors' names went with which houses? Who handled the parts of life? My father, a retired electrician who was brilliant with his hands and hopeless with almost everything administrative, had simply never needed to learn because my mother had always handled them. For the first 6 months after she passed, my father was, understandably, a shadow of himself. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. He stopped going to the weekly poker game he'd played in for over a decade. My sister Amanda and I took turns checking on him, bringing meals, sitting with him through the particular silence of a house that used to have 2 people in it and now only had 1. It was hard. In the ordinary, expected way grief is hard, and we did what families do. We showed up, we worried, we slowly watched him take small steps back towards something resembling life. About 8 months after my mother's death, at the gentle encouragement of a hospice grief counselor, my father started attending a weekly grief support group at a community center near his house. Amanda and I were relieved when he told us about it. It felt like exactly the kind of thing that might help. A room full of people who understood, specifically, the particular loneliness of losing a spouse after decades of marriage. A community he could lean on that wasn't just his children checking in out of obligation and love. It was at that support group, in his 3rd or 4th session, that he met Dawn. I want to be careful, in telling this story, not to paint every relationship a grieving widower forms with a new person as inherently suspicious. That's not what this story is about, and it's not fair to the many people who genuinely find companionship again after loss, in ways that enrich rather than endanger their lives. What happened with Dawn was different, and it took my sister and me embarrassingly long to fully recognize how different it actually was, because the early signs looked, on the surface, like exactly the kind of gentle, supportive companionship we'd hoped my father might eventually find. Dawn was 61, recently divorced according to what she told my father, and by all early accounts, warm, attentive, and deeply sympathetic to his grief. My father called me about 6 weeks after they started spending time together, his voice sounding lighter than it had in almost a year. "I met someone at the group," he said. "Her name's Dawn. She's easy to talk to. I think it's good for me, having someone who really understands what this feels like." I was happy for him. Genuinely. I told him so. Amanda, when I called to update her, felt the same cautious optimism I did. Relief that our father was finding some warmth again, tempered by the ordinary, reasonable caution any adult child feels when a parent starts a new relationship less than a year after losing their other parent. The changes started small enough that neither Amanda nor I fully clocked them as a pattern until months had already passed. First, it was scheduling. My father, who had always been reliably available for our regular Sunday dinners, started having conflicts. Nothing dramatic, just enough. Dawn and I already had plans, or were heading out to visit her sister that weekend, to gradually thin out the frequency of our time together, from weekly to every other week, to, eventually, once a month, if we were lucky. Then it was information. My father, who had always talked easily and openly about his daily life, doctor's appointments, home repairs, whatever he and my mother used to discuss over dinner and now discussed with us instead, became noticeably vaguer. When I asked how a cardiology follow-up had gone, he'd say fine, no issues, without the usual details he used to volunteer unprompted. When Amanda asked about a home repair he'd mentioned needing, he'd change the subject slightly, mention something about Dawn helping him find a contractor, and move the conversation along before either of us could ask follow-up questions. I want to be honest that during this period, I chalked most of this up to the ordinary awkwardness of a parent navigating a new relationship while trying not to make his adult children feel replaced or sidelined. It felt, at the time, like reasonable boundary setting on his part, not manipulation. It took a specific incident, about 7 months into his relationship with Dawn, for me to start seeing the pattern differently. My father had a minor fall at home. Nothing serious, a stumble on a loose stair tread that resulted in a bruised hip and a trip to urgent care, but the kind of incident that, for a 70-year-old man living alone, understandably worried Amanda and me when we found out about it 3 days after it happened. 3 days. My father, who used to call me the moment anything happened, who called me within an hour of the doctor telling him about a minor arrhythmia 2 years earlier, just so I'd know, hadn't told either of us about a fall and an urgent care visit for 3 full days. When I asked him why, he said, a little too quickly, Dawn took care of me. There wasn't really anything for you to do, so I didn't want to worry you over nothing. I remember hanging up that call and sitting with a feeling I couldn't fully name yet, a low, uneasy sense that something about the shape of my father's life had shifted in a way I didn't have full visibility into anymore. Amanda had her own version of this same growing unease, and when we finally compared notes properly, about 2 months later, over coffee without our father present, we realized we'd both been independently collecting small, dismissible incidents for months, moments that, taken individually, seemed like nothing, but that, laid out together across a timeline, formed a pattern neither of us liked. Amanda told me about a visit where she'd noticed Dawn hovering nearby during almost the entire conversation, never quite leaving the room, but never quite participating directly either, present in a way that subtly shaped what our father felt comfortable saying. I told her about a moment during a phone call where I'd heard Dawn's voice faintly in the background, prompting our father with something I couldn't fully make out, right before he changed the subject away from a question I'd asked about his upcoming cardiology appointment. Neither of these moments, on their own, would have concerned either of us. Together, they started painting a picture we didn't want to fully look at yet. Dad no longer attended his monthly veterans breakfast, a standing tradition for over 15 years. Dad had stopped calling his older brother, our Uncle Pete, with whom he'd always been close. Dad's answers about finances had become increasingly vague. When Amanda, a financial advisor by profession, asked casually about his investment accounts during a rare visit, he deflected in a way that felt uncharacteristically evasive for a man who had always been transparent, almost to a fault, about money. We also started noticing a subtler pattern in how Dawn spoke about our family, in the handful of interactions Amanda and I had directly with her during this period. She was never openly hostile or dismissive of us. That would have been easy to identify and push back against. Instead, her comments carried a particular, gentle undertone that, in isolation, sounded almost supportive, but that, over time, seemed designed to subtly recast our concern as a burden on our father rather than an expression of love. Your dad worries so much about disappointing you too, she said once, during a rare joint dinner, in a tone that sounded sympathetic but that I later recognized as planting a specific idea, that our presence in his life came with pressure and obligation, while her presence, by contrast, offered him ease and understanding. Amanda picked up on something similar during a different visit, when Dawn mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she'd told our father he shouldn't feel guilty about spending less time with his children, since grown kids have their own busy lives, and parents deserve some happiness that's just for them. On its surface, this sounded like reasonable, even generous advice. In the context of everything else we were noticing, it read very differently. A subtle permission structure, gradually giving our father emotional cover to deprioritize the relationships that had defined his entire life before Dawn arrived in it. The moment that finally broke through our reluctance to fully confront what was happening came 9 months into Dad and Dawn's relationship, when my father mentioned, almost in passing during a phone call, that he and Dawn had started looking into some paperwork, just to make sure everything's organized properly, given my age. What kind of paperwork? I asked, something tightening in my chest even before he answered. Oh, just updating some things. Dawn's been really helpful walking me through it. She dealt with a lot of this stuff when her own mother was declining, so she really understands the process. I called Amanda within minutes of hanging up. We agreed, that day, that we needed to actually see our father, in person, without Dawn present, and have a direct, honest conversation about what was happening, something that, embarrassingly, we hadn't yet managed to do in any meaningful way across 9 months of watching this unfold in scattered, deflected phone calls. Getting that meeting took another 6 weeks, largely because our father, whether consciously or not by that point, had become remarkably difficult to pin down for any extended time without Dawn somehow being present or nearby. When we finally managed it, a Saturday afternoon Amanda arranged by specifically timing our visit around a hair appointment Dawn had mentioned in passing, our father seemed almost relieved to have real, uninterrupted time with his children, a detail that, in hindsight, told us more about the situation than almost anything else we observed. We didn't approach it as an ambush. We talked beforehand about how important it was to lead with love and concern rather than accusation, understanding that if our suspicions were right, our father was likely already being subtly coached, whether deliberately or not, to view any family concern as controlling or unsupportive of his happiness. We sat with him in his living room, my mother's old living room, still arranged mostly the way she'd left it, and asked him, gently, direct questions about the paperwork he'd mentioned. What we learned, over the course of that difficult afternoon, was more extensive than either Amanda or I had feared. Over the preceding 2 months, with Dawn's encouragement and, according to our father, her direct assistance in finding someone reputable, he had met with an estate attorney neither of our family's longtime lawyer nor either of us had ever heard of, and had begun the process of updating his power of attorney designation from Amanda, who had held it since our mother's death, the natural, sensible choice, given her financial background, to Dawn. He'd also, we learned that same afternoon, added Dawn as a joint account holder on his primary checking account for convenience, in case anything happens, and had begun discussing, though not yet finalized, updates to his will that would include Dawn as a beneficiary, something that, again, he described as simply fair, given how much she's done for me. I want to describe what it felt like. Sitting in that living room, watching our father describe these decisions with the same calm, reasonable tone he'd always used for genuinely reasonable decisions throughout his life, and realizing that from his perspective, inside whatever version of reality he'd been gradually guided into over 9 months, none of this felt alarming to him at all. It felt, to him, like sensible planning, guided by someone who loved him and understood, from her own experience, exactly what kind of paperwork an aging person in his position should be organizing. Amanda, careful and measured even in that moment, asked him directly, "Dad, when did you last talk to your actual lawyer, the one who's handled your and Mom's estate planning for 20 years, about any of this?" He paused, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that looked like genuine uncertainty. Dawn said her attorney would be more efficient, since he specializes in this kind of thing more specifically. "Dad, our family's lawyer has been specializing in exactly this kind of thing for 2 decades. Why would you need someone new, someone Dawn found, instead of someone you and Mom already trusted?" I watched my father sit with that question for a long moment, and I think, looking back, that was the actual turning point. Not some dramatic confrontation, but a single, quiet moment where our father, for the first time in 9 months, was forced to examine a decision from outside the careful, isolating frame he'd been gradually placed inside, and found that, examined that way, it didn't fully make sense even to him. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. Our father wasn't ready to fully condemn Dawn, or even to fully acknowledge the pattern we were describing, and pushing too hard, we both understood, risked driving him further into her orbit rather than out of it. The same dynamic that makes intervening in any situation involving isolation and undue influence so difficult, regardless of the specific relationship involved. But we planted something that day, a seed of doubt, a reminder that he had people who had loved him for his entire life, long before Dawn existed in it, and that those people were still there, still paying attention, still willing to ask hard questions even when it was uncomfortable. Before we left that afternoon, Amanda made one more request, careful and deliberate. She asked our father if he'd be willing to simply have coffee with their longtime family attorney, Mr.Heres, a man who had handled our parents' estate planning for over 2 decades and who had known our father since before Amanda or I were born, not to change anything, not to sign anything, just to talk, as old friends, about what he was considering. Our father, perhaps sensing the fairness of this small, low-pressure request, agreed. That coffee meeting didn't happen for almost 3 weeks, largely because our father found reasons to postpone it twice. Reasons that, in hindsight, felt less like genuine scheduling conflicts and more like a kind of unconscious avoidance, a reluctance to hold his recent decisions up against the scrutiny of someone who had known him and known our mother for that long. When the meeting finally happened, Mr. Ferris called Amanda directly afterward, with our father's permission, sounding more concerned than either of us had heard him in the entire time we'd known him professionally. "I want to be careful here," he told Amanda, "because your father is a competent adult, fully capable of making his own decisions, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But some of what he described to me, the timeline, the specific provisions this new attorney drafted, the joint account, those are patterns I've seen before, in situations that didn't end well for the person in your father's position. I'd strongly encourage getting him more time, more perspective, before anything else moves forward." Over the following 4 months, Amanda and I made a deliberate, coordinated effort to reinsert ourselves into our father's daily life in ways that were harder to gradually edge out. We stopped simply hoping he'd make time for us and started actively creating recurring structure. A standing Wednesday night dinner that Amanda scheduled and confirmed herself rather than leaving to informal arrangement. Direct outreach to his brother Pete and several of his old poker buddies, encouraging them to reach back out, rebuilding the wider network of relationships that had quietly atrophied over the preceding months. We also, with significant reluctance but clear necessity, contacted our family's actual longtime attorney, explaining the situation and asking him to reach out directly to our father, reestablishing a relationship built on decades of trust rather than 9 months of increasingly isolated influence. That conversation, it turned out later, was pivotal. Our father's old attorney reviewed the paperwork Don's attorney had begun preparing and flagged several provisions that, in his professional assessment, were unusually favorable to Don given the short duration of the relationship. A professional, credentialed voice our father trusted enough to actually listen to in a way he hadn't fully been able to listen to his own children. The full unraveling of the relationship happened gradually over the following 2 months, not through some single dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, cumulative effect of our father spending more time back in the wider orbit of people who had known and loved him for decades, each conversation gently, naturally surfacing small inconsistencies and concerns that, together, eventually became impossible for him to fully ignore. The final break came when our father discovered, during a conversation with his re-established attorney, that Don had, in fact, been through a strikingly similar pattern with a previous partner, a widower she'd met at a different grief support group 4 years earlier, whose family had, according to public probate records the attorney was able to access, contested significant estate changes made during a brief relationship that had also involved joint bank accounts and updated power of attorney documents. I don't know the full truth of what happened in that earlier situation, and I want to be careful not to overstate certainty about intentions I can't fully verify. What I know is that when our father learned this information, something in him finally, fully shifted. He ended his relationship with Dawn shortly afterward, reverted the power of attorney designation back to Amanda, removed her from his checking account, and never finalized the will changes that had been in progress. It's been just over 2 years since that difficult Saturday afternoon in Mom's old living room. My father is, by every measure Amanda and I can observe, fully himself again. Back at his monthly veterans breakfast, back to weekly calls with his brother Pete, back to our Sunday dinners, which have never once, since Dawn, needed active scheduling effort to maintain, because he shows up, consistently, the way he always used to before those 11 months. He doesn't talk about Dawn much, and when he does, it's with a kind of quiet, retrospective bewilderment, as though he's describing something that happened to a slightly different version of himself, one he can recognize but doesn't quite fully understand anymore. I don't know how it happened so gradually, he told me once, almost a year after everything ended. Every individual step felt reasonable at the time. It was only looking back at all of it together that I could see what it actually added up to. I asked him once, carefully, whether he thought Dawn had set out deliberately to isolate him from the beginning, or whether it had happened more gradually, less consciously, growing out of her own patterns from whatever led to that earlier situation with her previous partner. He thought about that question for a long time before answering. I honestly don't know, he said. Maybe it doesn't fully matter, in the end, whether it was deliberate or just some kind of pattern she falls into without fully realizing it herself. Either way, I ended up somewhere I never would have chosen to be if I'd been paying closer attention to how I got there. I think about that sentence often because I think it captures something important about how this kind of isolation actually works in families far beyond just ours. It rarely arrives as one obvious, alarming moment. It arrives in dozens of small, individually defensible steps. A missed dinner here, a vague answer there, a new attorney who seems reasonable enough in the moment. Each one easy to dismiss on its own, and only fully visible as a pattern once someone outside the situation is paying close enough attention over a long enough period to actually connect them. Amanda and I still check in with each other regularly about Dad, more deliberately than we used to before any of this happened. We've learned, the hard way, that love alone isn't always enough to protect someone from this kind of gradual isolation. It also takes active, ongoing attention, the willingness to notice small inconsistencies and ask uncomfortable questions before those inconsistencies accumulate into something much harder to reverse. We've also talked, since then, about how differently things might have gone if Dawn's pattern with her previous partner hadn't left the kind of documented trail our attorney was able to find. Not every family gets that piece of luck. Not every situation like ours has a public probate record that happens to surface the exact information needed to break through a parent's carefully maintained trust in a new partner. I think about the families who don't get that lucky break, who watch a parent's estate quietly reshaped by someone who entered their life during a vulnerable, grieving period, with no clear evidence trail to point to, nothing concrete enough to counter the simple, repeated reassurance that everything is fine, that the children are simply overreacting, that this new person genuinely understands their parent in ways the grown children, busy with their own lives, no longer fully can. My father has, since then, updated his estate planning documents with Mr. Ferris, formalizing clear, specific provisions designed to make this kind of rapid, isolated change more difficult to replicate in the future, regardless of who might eventually re-enter his life. He's also, cautiously, started attending a different social group, a woodworking class at the same community center, rebuilding a version of social connection that doesn't carry the same specific vulnerability the grief support group inadvertently created. Not because grief support groups are inherently dangerous, but because that particular room, filled entirely with people at their most vulnerable, turned out to be exactly the kind of environment where someone like Dawn could find and gradually reshape a person as genuinely lonely and grieving as our father was. If you've ever watched a parent or grandparent gradually pulled away from your family by someone new, in ways that felt too small and reasonable, individually, to fully justify raising an alarm, I want to hear how you handled it, because I know now that we came dangerously close to losing years of my father's remaining life to a relationship built, at least in significant part, on careful, incremental isolation. We got him back. Not everyone's family is as fortunate, and I think about that often whenever I hear this kind of story indifferently than ours did.